Alan, I'm going to ask you to say a few words. Let's keep it a little bit relatively short.
Sure. Just ditto what the genius said, so therefore I get an A plus copied his paper. But I think as an attorney, I think the very first thing that you need to do is be prepared. So I think the most important thing as an immigrant in this country right now is to just be prepared. We know what policies they're speaking of, and whether you're authorized or not authorized, things may change in the law that could impact your family and your assets in this country. So you should start planning for those things. And just remember that Noah built the ark under the awareness that there was going to be a flood, and that the ark itself was built by a novice, and the Titanic was built by people who knew what they were doing. So if you think of Congress as that Titanic, hopefully it'll go down, and you just need to talk to your legal advisors and be ready for the fight.
Paul.
Like the geniuses said, yeah, it seems to me that there's two big issues I'd like to address. One of them is protection, and I don't mean just protection for self. There are people around us who need protection. I cannot tell you the number because I do not know, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of undocumented students at my university. I know a bunch of them, and someone needs to stand between them and those who would do bad things to them, and there are lots of those folks out there. And I want to challenge everybody who's here today to be one of those people who stands between those who are in jeopardy and those who would do them harm. Because that's what didn't happen in Germany in 1932 after Hitler was elected. He didn't seize the government. He was elected by a minority. I'm not suggesting that there are parallels. But there is that possibility that this might go very, very badly if we don't stand up. Part of that standing up is to not accept bogus arguments. And I just want to give you a couple of points in that direction. One of them is, the fact is immigrants are not a problem. 13% of the US population are immigrants, 26% are immigrants and their children. We have had numbers very much like that in almost every decade, except for about 3 decades in the early part of the 20th century, throughout our entire history. 1.2 to 1.3 million immigrants come here each year, which is about the same absolute numbers as a century ago. But we have 4 times the population that we had a century ago. So we have the capacity to assimilate a much larger number of people than we actually are dealing with. Immigrants are more than twice as likely as native-born Americans to start businesses. Immigrants are far less likely to commit crime than are the native-born. And everybody agrees about those numbers except for the folks who make up their own numbers. Second thing, immigrants without papers are not a problem. Every year for the last 8 years, the number of folks who came into the United States, whether they came in on tourist visas and overstayed them or came across the border, every year since 2008, that number has gone down. Hasn't gone up. There isn't some big surge in illegal immigrants. The total number of people without papers topped out in 2007 at a little over 12 million. Now it's a little under 11 million people in the country. The number of people who without papers who are in the labor force topped out in 2009. 2/3 of the people who are here without papers have lived here for 10 years or more. They have an investment in America. All of this discussion in politics has been framed by bogus understandings of what's going on. There are some problems. Immigrant detention is a problem. We're here at the Japanese American National Museum, and one of its great themes is the detention of an immigrant people, which is one of the ugliest pieces of American history. How come we don't know that there are 34,040 dedicated beds that have to be filled in immigrant detention centers in our country today. How come we don't know what happens there? Well, partly because 2/3 of them are in private, for-profit prisons that have almost no supervision. Little children traumatized in private, for-profit prisons. That's a problem. Xenophobia is a problem not just here, but around the world. Brexit, Marine Le Pen and the Front National in France, governments in Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, Romania. This is not just an American problem, it's a problem a whole bunch of other places. We need to stand up.
Thank you, Paul. Karthick.
Thank you. I normally do numbers, but Paul has done that so beautifully that I don't need to talk about numbers at all. What I'll start off with is actually something that's very fresh. This happened yesterday in my master's students class in our public policy program. And it was the first meeting that we had. We had to juggle around our schedule. It was the first meeting since the election. And we took time out of class, not by choice. I talked a little bit about the election update and what kind of policy changes we could expect. But one of the students who was supposed to present asked me, I'm going to Bangladesh, back to her home country, and is there going to be a problem when I come back? And we got down to the nitty-gritty of when her flight is coming back, who's going to be in charge. And I said, I don't think you have anything to worry about. But we spent about 5 minutes, including someone who is the head of a student program, essentially saying, get all of your documentation and share that with the university so that we can track you when you come back, when you're anticipated to be back here. That is a very perilous and scary moment, not only for the student, but for me as an instructor and for the entire class. And it's not just about unauthorized immigrants. It's also about people on student visas, people who are legal permanent residents who our president-elect has waived this magic number of 2 to 3 million who would be caught in that dragnet. So these are very perilous times. In terms of understanding it, I'll just say a couple of things with some recent work that I've done that I think could be helpful, and I'm happy to talk more about it later. One is this book that just came out called Framing Immigrants. And it's precisely to show how there are all of these things that are actually true, but have no basis in our understandings. And part of that is because elected officials have an inordinate amount of power in setting our information agenda. We expect news media to tell the truth, to challenge. But instead, what they do is they follow the statements and pronouncements of people in power, even if that information is not only inaccurate, but completely misleading and intended to deceive. So that's a problem. And often you have this false equivalency in which you have one perspective and the other perspective, and the citizenry is left shaking their head, scratching their head, or just not knowing what to do. But in the meantime, people think that migration from Mexico is a problem. It is not. It's a problem that ended over 10 years ago. People think unauthorized immigrants are only Mexican immigrants, and they're not. As Stewart said, there's a big increase in Asian undocumented immigration in the last decade. Crime, you can just go down the list. There are all of these things that are distortions that now we're seeing can have very real consequences when policies, you don't even need an act of Congress for some of the things that are being discussed. So framing is important, but key to that framing is that we need to take the power of frames into our own hands. So one of the things that I've been telling some of the organizers of these university sanctuary movements is that in addition to getting these declarations by colleges and universities, many of these colleges and universities are in rural areas. Write op-eds in your local newspapers. Because many of those local newspapers do wire stories that essentially relay information from people in Washington, D.C., which again, provide a very distorted view of what America is, who America is. So we have to take that power into our hands. We cannot just let others do the framing for us. Second thing I'll say is states and localities and universities and churches are more important than ever. The only way we repair and restore our democracy is to build civil society back up again and to have our local jurisdictions and state jurisdictions be the bulwarks of protection. On top of that, from what Paul said, absolutely, we have to be ready to put our bodies on the line and to interrupt these actions. Because all of this talk about sanctuary jurisdictions only say that we will not cooperate with federal enforcement. They cannot say that we will resist, because that would be violating federal law. So we need to kind of really conceptualize and operationalize what civil disobedience looks like, and make sure that our institutions protect those who engage in acts of civil disobedience so that faculty don't lose their jobs or tenure, students don't get expelled for taking a principled stand in protecting the most vulnerable among us. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.